and verse 16. I want everybody to look at chapter 22, and verse 2 and verse 16, and tell me what's different and why. Julie's not here, so I'll probably pick. No, Julie is here. Yes, she's not close. So. Yeah. So I was going to pick on Christy. So, can you see a difference between verse 2 and verse 16 in regards to his question? Oh, it does. You know, that's why I call on you. You're just so smart. Whom you love. I want you to notice that before the sacrifice, the way God describes Isaac, he describes him in a threefold way. He does that to go with chapter 21 and verse 3. It says, Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Isaac bore to him, Isaac, this threefold way. He describes him in a threefold way, and he adds, whom you love. But after the sacrifice, he doesn't describe him that way. Twice after the sacrifice, when God describes Isaac, he drops this, whom you love. So does anybody find that significant? I'm the teacher, and I'm going to let you know it is significant, so somebody should be telling me something. But we're going to let the elder's daughter go.
Once he sacrifices Isaac, then he loves God more than he does the son.
Oh, very good. All right. When we come to chapter 22, and we see that we have God's promises being fulfilled, that we finally have the son that was born of Abraham and Sarah, that we're going to finally get going on all the promises that God has given Abraham, and it's been 25 years. Once we finally have this child, the question arises, is Abraham going to love this child more than he loves me? And related to that, is Abraham going to love what's going to come about because of this child more than me? You want to remember that Abraham left his old country because God said, I'm going to make you rich and powerful and famous, all these things that were good. Now, of course, we're reading it through Christian eyes, and we think about all the spiritual blessings that God truly means. But Abraham, hearing the voice, understands that God's going to make him powerful, make his descendants awesome, going to have all these kings and queens come from him. He's going to have children. I don't know how long he's been married at this time, but he has no children, so everything God says is going to be good, good, and great and awesome. So it goes along, and he brings Lot, which was a mistake, finally get rid of Lot. Then he has Ishmael, which was a mistake, finally get rid of Ishmael, and now we have Isaac. And Abraham could look at Isaac and say, you know, God's fulfilling his promises. I don't need to worry about anything. It's going forward finally here. And then God says, I want you to sacrifice your son. He says it the same way that he told Abraham to leave in chapter 12. Go. So he says in verse 1 of chapter 22, now it came about after these things, and these things is talking about the whole life of Abraham, after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said to him, here I am. He said to him, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. It's interesting that when you look at the history of this verse, you see people run the gambit on what God is saying here. A number of ancient Jews thought that God wasn't asking this, that it was Satan asking it. Some other ancient Jews thought that Satan had somehow tricked or maneuvered God into asking this, just a reverse mirror image of what happens in Job. Other people think that God's not at all serious, that God is saying these things, just wants to see what Abraham's going to do. And then, of course, everybody wonders what Abraham is actually thinking. Because you notice it takes 3 days, and he talks about getting things ready, and then he gets there, and we don't have any indication about what Abraham's thinking. And Isaac is almost a prop. When the story's done and Isaac is not sacrificed, you don't hear about Isaac. I don't know if you noticed that. So in verse 3, it says, "So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for a burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told them." In verse 5, Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I, lad, will go over there, and we will worship and return to you." And then you get down to verse 19. "So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba." And we don't hear anything about Isaac at all. Matter of fact, we don't hear anything about Isaac until we pretty much get to his wife. And it's just like he's dropped out of the story. And he has, literally speaking. Because that's what the point was. Was Abraham going to trust God and serve God regardless of what he was going to get? Because all the promises, you want to remember, everything was tied up in Isaac. Everything was tied up in that child's birth. And until that child was born, the promises were just so much pie in the sky because he didn't have the promised land. He didn't have descendants that were numberless. He didn't have kings and queens coming from him. He didn't have any of that stuff. But once we got this child who was circumcised on the 8th day, per the covenant God keeps making with him, well, now things are starting to go forward. And the question is, what are you going to do, Abraham? I don't know if you've looked at Abraham's life from chapter 12 through 22, but he has a series of missteps, or he has a very human existence. Much like us, we have our good days, bad days. We do some good things. We really just gung-ho trusting God. Other times we just don't really sort of trust God that much, and we just sort of forget about God. And then we go years without thinking about it, and then all of a sudden we get right, and we go good, and back and forth. And so you have all this history of Abraham, and the question comes down to, who are you going to serve? Are you really going to serve me wholeheartedly? Are you really going to be perfect? Are you really going to be faithful to me? Or are you just going to trust everything in this son? So at the end of chapter 22, Isaac drops out. This is also one reason why we don't have any mention about Isaac's age. We run the gamut about how old he is. From being almost a toddler to whenever he was weaned to being 37. Because the next you hear about Isaac is because Sarah dies, and she dies when Isaac is 37. So a number of the ancient rabbis said that Sarah died because her husband heard a voice and went to go sacrifice their son. Her only son that she had to wait so long to get. Now, of course, the Bible doesn't say anything about that. It doesn't say how Sarah interpreted everything. It doesn't even say what Abraham said to Sarah when God said, "Go sacrifice your son, your only son, the son whom you love." He didn't say anything to Sarah, at least as far as the text is concerned. But of course, you've got to wonder what's going on. It doesn't show what Abraham was thinking the whole time he's walking on a donkey, doing all these things here. It just shows him going forward and being faithful to God. You want to realize that the whole point of all this, the angel says in verse 12, And he said to him, do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So that's the second time God talks about your son, your only son, but not the son whom you love, from me. The whole purpose was to have Abraham fear God, but fear God in the Old Testament is talking about being faithful to God, much like the New Testament. I have a hard time hearing the word fear God and not associate it with fearing dad, fearing spankings, fearing punishment, fearing the government. I, to this day, driving along, and I see a police officer, then I immediately check everything. It's like, okay, am I going the speed limit? Not. If I'm not, I need to slow down because I'm afraid. And even when I'm on cruise control, and of course, if I'm on cruise control, then I'm probably going over the speed limit. That's the reason to use cruise control, 3 or 4 miles over that. Then I'll still see those police officers, and I'll be afraid, like, what am I doing here? So I have that very human sense of fear in me that's cultural. And so when I hear about fearing God, I always think about it in a negative thing, even though I've been a Christian for 30 years, and I know that God doesn't treat me that way. It's hard for me to read the word fear God and not actually be afraid because, of course, he created everything, could destroy everything, and so forth and so on. But really, fearing God means you're going to be faithful to God, trust God, which is why whom you love is dropped off, because now Abraham trusts God wholly and solely. So in Hebrews, in chapter 11, when it makes a commentary on this, it talks about that Abraham believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead. So Abraham went there fully prepared to sacrifice his son, and he believed that when he did that God was going to raise him from the dead. That's what he believed was going to happen. So he was going forward with that, and he didn't necessarily know how God was going to raise him from the dead, how that was going to happen, if it was going to be immediate, over time, whatever. He's just going to go do it and then move forward with his life, trusting God. But that's what the Hebrew writer wants us to understand. That's what Moses wants to understand, that Abraham is now the father of our faith because he is that example of faith, solely and wholly trusting God. After all the decades of sometimes trusting God, mostly trusting self, mostly just trying to figure out how to survive in this life, he's just going to trust God completely. Does that sort of answer your question? Go ahead. What? It didn't? Right. And so that's why I said, oh, you want to know about the only son. Gotcha, yeah. The only son, God describes it as the only son to make it show that it's from Sarah and Abraham, even though Abraham had a son with Hagar, Ishmael. He described him as the only son because you're the only son of promise. So you want to realize that we describe our relationships in a lot of different forms or fashion, but that was his only son because that was the son that was going to become from promise. When you look at Abraham's life, he thought he could help God or understood what God wanted to accomplish through him by giving him a child, by doing Lot, doing Eliezer, doing Ishmael, when God all along said, no, 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 I want Isaac. And I will wait until such a time that you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that only I could have given you Isaac. And it came from me because I am the God who gives life. I'm the God who brings life. I am the creator of everything. Sorry about that. Other questions about the sacrifice? Yes, sir. Oh, okay. So Roddy asked about only being translated unique. You certainly can. We have a tendency to see the phrase only there and think back to Jesus in John 3:16, the only begotten of the Father here. That's not the same word. It wasn't used in the Hebrew Bible or in the Greek Septuagint, the only begotten, though in Hebrews 11, it does use the same word. In Hebrews 11:17, it describes Isaac as the only begotten, the only son, the unique one, which is what John means when he talks about in John 3:16 that Jesus is the only begotten. He means he's the unique one of God. He's the unique son of God, different from everything else. Isaac was the unique son of Abraham because he had both Sarah and Abraham as his parents. Ishmael only had Abraham as his parents. We think about that sometimes as strange, but you want to remember that everybody was going along with marrying within the family, endomy, marrying within the family, so you married close relatives. And so you didn't necessarily always have the same two parents that you would have had by the time Moses comes along. Other questions? Yes, sir. Did you say the servant ladies? They did. We will see as the Pentateuch progresses that Sarah never acknowledges Ishmael as her son, even though that was the whole purpose of giving Hagar to Abraham, so she would have a son. But Isaac and Jacob, they do, if they have, sorry, it's just Jacob, I think. No. The bondservants that are given to their husbands, their wives do acknowledge those children as belonging to them. So Sarah was unique in that she didn't acknowledge Ishmael as having anything to do with her, which is one more reason why she runs him off as he gets older here. Other questions on chapter 22? Okay. Let's think back to chapters 20 and 21. All of you should have read it multiple times, so all of you know about the story. You know, we have Abraham lying about his wife again to Abimelech. We have Abimelech getting upset. We have the birth of Isaac. We have Ishmael making fun of Isaac. We have Hagar and Ishmael being run off. We have another little story about Abimelech. So we know all those stories. What we need to realize is that as Christians, we need to try to grow an understanding of things. Over in Hebrews chapter 5, Paul talks about that by reason of use, we have our senses trained to discern between good and evil. What that should teach us at the very least is that sometimes the Bible does not clearly spell out something that's good or evil, and God expects us to use the wisdom we've acquired from the Bible and extrapolate from that to determine whether something's good or evil. That's why the Bible doesn't address speeding. It never addresses us going too fast, breaking the speed limit, or anything like that. It doesn't say those sort of things here. It says stealing's wrong, murder's wrong, adultery's wrong. We get later on, talks about paying your taxes to the government, but it doesn't say you've got to obey every law of the government. God expects us to look at the Bible, read it in totality, and grow in our wisdom. With that being the case, the question I want to ask each of you is looking at Abraham's total life, what does Abraham teach us about marriage? You want to realize that the Bible assumes marriage to be true, though it doesn't necessarily talk about marriage so much. It does talk about husbands and wives. We don't have anything about a marriage ceremony. We don't have anything about who can get married, who can't get married. We don't have anything about ages. We don't have any advice. We don't have husbands should be doing these things, should be saying these words. We just don't have a lot of information about marriage. It's just assumed to be true, and God leaves it up to us to extrapolate some truths. So looking at the life of Abraham, what could Abraham's life teach us about marriage? Yes, sir. Okay. Happy wife, happy life. Now, that is true, but it's not true. Were you going to say something, Steve? Okay, I just want to make sure. It's not true because Sarah, of course, gives Abraham bad instructions in her attempt to be happy. What instance am I referring to? What was that? That's right. So Sarah tells Abraham, I don't have any kids. God says we're going to have kids. Take my slave that we got in Egypt long ago. You sleep with her. We're going to have a kid. That kid will be my kid. And of course, that doesn't work out that way. Because when Hagar gets pregnant, and Hagar now looks down on Sarah because she could never conceive, well, Sarah gets bitter. And she doesn't like Hagar at all. She runs her off, as a matter of fact. And then the angel has to say, you need to go on back. Go on back being a slave. Go on back being beat, mistreated, whatever. Just go on back and be there. Abraham should not have really listened to his wife in that sense. I want you to notice that if you look at the history of Abraham, we have sister as wife, wife as sister, wife. Abraham moves along these progressive paths and trying to understand what it means to be a husband. See, he married his sister because I believe they had the same father, different mothers. So I get myself confused. So he marries his sister, and then we find out a number of times that he passes off her as his sister when they go to various towns. When they came to Egypt, and they go down to Egypt, Abraham clearly tells Sarah, they're going to kill me. I need you to tell everybody you're my sister. Now, what that means, he doesn't spell it out as clearly as we would hope. What that means is somebody's going to marry you, going to have sex with you, but I'm going to live. That's what I want to happen, Sarah. Save me, help me to live. And Sarah goes along. Now, we don't know if she goes along willingly, or if she's upset, or what. It doesn't say anything about it here. But that's what happens. So Pharaoh sees her, marries her, has sex with her, and of course, God is not at all pleased by this. So bad things start happening to Pharaoh. Pharaoh finally figures it out. He enriches Abraham more so than what he did when he took his sister. And so Abraham walks away with all this wealth and a woman who's now committed adultery because he told her to go commit adultery. And he did that because he just viewed this wife as a sister. He wasn't seeing her as a wife at all. He wasn't seeing her as a wife, just as this family member. And surely the family member should keep me safe because, I don't know, because God talked to me, because I'm important, because I'm the guy. I don't know. But that's what he was afraid of. And it wasn't without reason that he was afraid, mind you, because people did take brides, and if you were married, they would just kill you because a husband is an inconvenience and a problem that is just going to wait to happen, so it's just better to make everything clean by murdering this person, and then this woman is now free to marry whomever, so you can take her and do this. If you treat this woman as your sister, well, you get wealth and you get to live. So we see that happen twice. With Pharaoh and Abimelech. At the start of Abraham's story, at the end of Abraham's story. And we understand that as he's traveled around, this is what he's done the whole time. It's just 2 times it turned out bad for him. With Abimelech, when God shows up in Abimelech's dream and says, you're going to die, Abimelech's like, hey, I've been righteous. I've done the right thing. You know my heart. He said, She was his sister. So I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't steal her from him. I just did the right thing. God's like, yeah, I understand. That's why you're still alive. That's why I'm telling you. And by killing Pharaoh, he doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to strike you down with a bolt of lightning. He meant that I close up all the wombs in your household and nobody's getting pregnant, which should tell us that Abimelech had been married to Sarah for a number of months. It wasn't like he took Sarah as his wife, had a dream, and then gave her up. He took Sarah as his wife, and then all of a sudden our whole household stops having children, stops getting pregnant. I have a dream, and then I go talk with Abraham. And you notice when he talks with Abraham, he is ticked off at Abraham. That, how dare you do this to me? How can you lie to me like this? Abraham's like, hey, I didn't lie. She really is my sister. And I don't know if you noticed how Abimelech speaks at the very end. So let's see something here. We'll drop down to verse 14. It says, Abimelech then took sheep and oxen and male and female servants and gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah. Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you. Settle wherever you please. To Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, it is your vindication before all who are with you, before all men, that you are cleared. Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maid, so they all bore children. For the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the household of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife, which is, of course, how it started out. Sarah, Abraham's wife. Sarah is Abraham's wife, not Abraham's sister. You don't treat your wife this way. You don't treat your wife as a disposable possession. You don't treat your wife as somebody who can take these horrible things upon her because you want to avoid some pain. Now, of course, we can look back with 2020 and say, well, Abraham should have trusted God when he went down to Egypt and realized that God would have protected them. But let's be clear, we don't have any indication that God told Abraham to go down to Egypt. Abraham should have trusted God and stayed where he was. Let's also be clear that God is not about having us avoid the consequences for our sinful actions. I always have a hard time reading about Hagar and Ishmael. Because in my mind, Sarah mistreats Hagar. Abraham doesn't do anything to back her up. And that was his wife. Hagar was his wife. That's what the text says, that this is your wife. And now you've had a child, and he doesn't do anything to protect her, and then gets her run off. She runs away. Angel sends her back. And then when Ishmael is 13 and he gets circumcised, part of the covenant, once we have Sarah being pregnant, well, then she wants to run off Ishmael and Hagar. Now, it does say Ishmael was doing something to Isaac. Paul talks about in Galatians that he was mocking him, so I don't know what was going on. Maybe he had a funny haircut. Maybe he was one of those babies that had a big forehead, cone shape. Who knows? But teenage boys are just not known for being sensitive. And you can tell that Sarah never had children because she'd have just chalked it up to a boy being a boy, slapped him silly, go do these things, and moved on. But she didn't. She got really upset. You need to run them off. And so then Abraham had to run them off. And I don't know if you notice between 21 and 22 that Abraham only gives Hagar and his son a little bit of wood, no, a little bit of water, a little bit of food. He runs them off. When he's going to sacrifice his only son, the son he loves, well, he has a donkey for that. We can go along here. So he's got plenty of wealth, but he just runs her off a little bit of food, a little bit of cash, and says, yeah, go on out there and die, which is what she's going to do. She's going to go out there and die. So God is not about us avoiding and getting rid of the consequences for our sinful actions. It was a mistake for Abraham to listen to Sarah and sleep with Hagar and take Hagar as his wife. Because in the beginning, It was one man, one woman. That is marriage. Okay? Adultery is not marriage. I'm just going to abbreviate that with an M. Polygamy. Yeah, I'm spelling it wrong. Not marriage. Probably should have abbreviated that one. Polygamy is not marriage. All that is marriage is one man, one woman for life. It is interesting that when Abraham starts to see Sarah as his wife, that things start to go well. Things start to progress along. That's the time in which he is trusting God fully, solely, wholly, because this is what it means. When we're single, we have a tendency to focus on ourselves, unless we're Christians, and we can sometimes focus on others. But when you're married, you have another person in your life, and you have to focus on them. You now realize once you have kids, that what that means is you're going to die. None of us are going to live forever. That's why we're having kids, to have that next generation. Sometimes we're a little more pragmatic. We're going to say, I'm going to have kids because when I get old, I want somebody who's forced to take care of me because that's the right thing to do. You know? Other times we're like, well, I want to have somebody have a better life than I had. So I'm going to try to do better for them than they did for me. Sometimes it's because we just weren't thinking, and when we had sex, we forgot that this is how God worked it out. Sex equals children most times, and then it's like, oh, you're pregnant. So now we're going to have kids here. But what we need to realize is that when you have a husband, you have a wife, now you guys are together, and you guys need to do things towards one another. It's not all about you anymore. Abraham, it was all about him. I marry my sister, make her my wife. I don't treat her my wife. Even though she is my wife, I treat her as my sister. Not until chapter 22, he finally treats her as his wife. And when he treats her as his wife, then he's just trusting wholly and solely in God. Now, I don't necessarily think that when Moses wrote these chapters about Abraham, that he was trying to give us a treatise about marriage. Okay? What I do think is God expects us to grow in our study of Scripture and look at these examples and come to realize that Abraham's life does teach us something about marriage and about how to treat your wife and how she is not this individual. She is not your sister. She is this woman over here. And you need to do things for her, take care of her. It's not her taking care of you. But of course, we don't see that, and we don't want to see that because the Bible doesn't say in so many verses, husbands take care of your wives, wives don't take care of your husbands. Though it does say things similar to that, which is why it talks about husbands love your wives, not wives love your husbands. Though we do have verses that talk about learning to love your husbands. So I want us, as we study the rest of the Old Testament, in the years that God still has left for each and every one of us, to start looking at things at a deeper level. You've all read the Bible multiple times. You've all read about Abraham sacrificing his son. It's not about Jesus. Even though people want to see in the sacrifice of Isaac that there's a Christ-like aspect to it. That's not what it's about. It's about wholly and solely trusting God. That's why you should take those three passages that talk about your son, your only son, the son whom you love, and then your son, your only son, and circle those. So the next time you read it, you recognize that they got rid of this you love because now Abraham solely and wholly loves God and not Isaac because he grew. Of course, it took him 2.5 decades to grow, but then, of course, most of us are that old, and we realize how slow we've learned, so we can cut Abraham some slack. Questions? Okay. So let's see something here. Let's see if we have anything we really need to talk about. So chapter 20, in verse 16, Abimelech gives her 1,000 pieces of silver. You want to realize that's like 25 pounds of silver. That's more silver than a person would earn in an entire lifetime. Even though converting to today's rates, it's only like $10,000. But in the ancient times, a person could not earn 1,000 pieces of silver in their life. So when Abimelech gives her 1,000 pieces of silver, it's his way of saying, I did not sleep with her. I did not defile her. She still has her honor. Let me give it to your brother, not your husband, because he lied to me, and show the world that you have kept your chastity before everybody. 1,000 pieces of silver was the bride price, at least as far as the writings we have that have been preserved, that the ancient gods would give to other goddesses. Because the bride price is the price you pay to buy a bride. So 1,000 pieces of silver is Abimelech's going above and beyond, saying, I didn't do anything, I was in the right, and Abraham was solely and wholly in the wrong. Which is sort of why Abraham seems sort of wimpy in his little excuse, well, she is my sister here. Let's see here. Chapter 21. What do I want to say about that? We have another account with Abimelech in chapter 21. What Moses wants you to get from this, at the very least, is that Abraham is now powerful. He's now important. He's not just some nomad roaming around the promised land or that area. He's somebody who deals with kings, and kings deal equally with him. So he has grown in his importance. We might have thought less of him because he keeps changing his location, because he keeps calling Sarah his wife, but Abimelech acknowledges that he really is important and that God is blessing him, and Abimelech wants to be blessed through Abraham. Let's see here. Hagar is just unique in that she gives God a name. She sees the angel of the Lord twice. She has the promises that God is going to take care of Ishmael and make him a great individual, and great nations are going to come from him. And you want to realize that the nations that come from Ishmael give Israel problems. That's because of Abraham's sin, because he should have never slept with Hagar. But he did that, and so for the next 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 centuries, life was miserable if you're a Jewish person here, because it just caused problems. And I don't know about you guys, but I've had problems with my marriage because I did things that were wrong and sinful at the start, that just keep repeating, that just keep going along, that just keep coming up decades later, because even though you get forgiveness, it doesn't take things away. You know, you can say you're sorry, but it doesn't take away the fact that you did things to hurt somebody here. Which is, of course, one of the reasons why we don't hear about Sarah anymore. Abraham didn't treat her well that he should have. God treated her well. I don't know if you noticed this, but in verse 1 of chapter 21, it says, Then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time in which God had spoken to him. So those two verses are talking about that God keeps all his promises, including the one he made to Sarah, and he's a God who fulfills his promises. He's not some flighty person who forgets his promises, even though it's been decades since he gave that first promise to Abraham. He is somebody who is always faithful, which is why Paul talks about in 2 Timothy that God is faithful even when we are faithless, which is, of course, the definition of sin. We're faithless. But God is just a faithful person here. In regards to Abimelech, in chapter 20, it says that Abraham is a prophet, and he prays to God to take care of Abimelech, which is what God tells him to do. And so you understand that a prophet is somebody who intercedes for somebody else, somebody who mediates God's blessings. And that's one of the roles Christians have today, is that we're supposed to be praying on behalf of other people. Not so much concerned about ourselves, because we're all the same family. So it's a given we're going to take care of us. We should be praying more for our neighbors who are lost, for the government who's lost, for people in other countries who don't know Christ, and asking God to work in their lives so they'll come to understand Jesus. That's what we need to be spending our time doing. I understand that we've grown up in the church hearing a never-ending parade of prayers about sick people. I don't know if you know this, but God, He knows everything. We may have forgotten it, but God doesn't forget anything. He knows everything. He knows it before it even happens. So He knows all of us that are sick. He knows the pain we have. As a matter of fact, He knows the pain more than we know the pain, because we're busy in denial and trying to ignore stuff and trying to figure out stuff, but He understands it all. And He knows what we need. God is not some heartless parent, i.e. a dad, who will just ignore the child and say, hey, shake it off, run it off, go do this, wait till your mom gets home, something like that. God actually cares for us, and He wants the best things for us, and more than that. He doesn't need us to always cry out to Him, God, I'm sick, I'm hurting, heal me. What He wants us to do, brothers and sisters, is cry out to Him saying, my neighbor doesn't know you, and I've talked with them, and I try to be kind to them, and I try to show them things, but they just don't want to hear. And they don't even give me a chance to say anything more than hi while I'm 50 feet away. So can you move in their life, God? Can you do something in their life so I can reach out, so I can be a blessing? Again, that's why we have money, to be a blessing to other people. Nancy? You're right. God does everything in His time, and you want to realize that the Bible shows us that God does things in His time, but He is willing to change things because of what we do. He is willing to listen to us. He is willing to change how things go. When you get to the book of Jeremiah, God goes out of His way 3 times specifically to tell Jeremiah, do not pray for these people. Because, of course, prophets prayed for people, and God changed things, what He was going to do. That's why Jonah was so ticked off at God, because he knew God was going to change what He was going to do and make a difference. So we can pray to God, and God can do something different than what He was going to do because we asked Him to do something different. Now, if it doesn't happen, no doubt it's because God is working at His time, and He's going to do it when He wants to do it. But that's not an excuse for us to not ask God to change something now. I don't know if you've had children who only ask one time for some food, because none of my kids are that way. Dad, can I have some chocolate? Later. 5 minutes later, Dad, can I have some chocolate? I said later. And in my mind, I'm thinking later as in hours, but maybe later as in days. But in their mind, it has been later. It's been 5 minutes. Well, God's later is definitely longer than my later, but eventually I give in or I get upset. God doesn't go that way. He's much better than I am. But sometimes I'll change what I'm doing because my child persists. And I'm like, sure, yes, you deserve a blessing. Let me give this to you here. God will change things because we are asking Him to that. And after all, God's goal is to save people. He's not going to be upset that we're saying, God, work in this person's life so we can save them. He's not going to say, stop bothering me with that prayer. Stop bothering me about your neighbor. He's not going to do that. He's going to say, pray more. I'm working on them. Now, I do want you to realize, one last thought here, is that when we're praying to God to work on our neighbors' lives, you want to realize that we're praying for something bad to happen to them. Nobody comes to Jesus when they win the lottery. But when their wife gets cancer, they're going to come to Jesus. When they lose their job, they're going to come to Jesus. They get that promotion, they don't need Jesus. When we're praying for God to move in people's lives, we need to expect bad things are going to happen to them, and we need to be there to help them. We need to be able to share that bad things have happened to us, and God has carried us through, and it didn't turn out the way we thought, like Abraham's life. It didn't turn out the way he thought. He finally got that child in a way he never imagined, but God was faithful. So we need to be praying for people more. All right, we'll start in chapter 23, and we'll get 2-3 chapters next week. Class dismissed. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. Keenan's class is canceled tonight. Thank you.